The air hung thick and greasy over Fort Reliance, a suffocating shroud woven from mangrove rot and the stale breath of 300 enslaved souls. It was the sort of humidity that didn't just sweat you out. It pressed the bone marrow itself, squeezing hope into a fine, painful powder. For 50 of those souls, however, that familiar oppressive heat had curdled into something far more intimate and immediate. The gnawing, scraping emptiness of their bellies, a perpetual echo chamber where sustenance used to reside. This was the hook, not a sharp, sudden jerk, but the slow, agonizing tightening of a noose made of hunger. It had been 4 days since Commander Theron Malaki, in a fit of calculated cruelty prompted by nothing more than a marginal dip in the sugar yield, had decreed the cessation of rations for the 50 field hands assigned to the farthest, most infertile quadrant of the plantation. These were the expendables, marked not only by their impossible labor, but now by the chilling silence of their bowls at sundown. The immediate consequence was pain, sharp and demanding. The terrifying underlying realization was that this was a slow execution. Malaki was not punishing them, he was liquidating them via engineered starvation. This brought the second hook into horrifying relief. Fort Reliance was not a typical plantation, situated precariously on a strategic spit of land overlooking the shipping lanes of the treacherous southern coast. It functioned as much as a military outpost as a commercial enterprise. The manor house, a monstrous white edifice of colonial arrogance, sat atop a rise, but its true power lay in the earthworks below. The great semicircle of the coastal battery, where 10 12-pounders, cast iron beasts polished smooth by years of indifferent maintenance, pointed eternally toward the sea. These were the very guns meant to repel pirates and foreign fleets, instruments of state-sanctioned violence that now represented the only conceivable, terrifying path to reversal. The 50 knew the guns existed, they knew how they operated, and now, fueled by the certainty of death by starvation, they began to measure the distance between their makeshift, famine-stricken quarters and the cold, unyielding iron muzzles. The year was 1787, the location, a forgotten pocket of the American South, where the law was Malaki's mood and mercy, was a forgotten rumor. Malaki himself was a man built of sharp angles and colder intentions, whose face seemed perpetually carved from granite, devoid of the softening elements of empathy or fatigue. He had inherited the post and the property, expanding the sugar mill through relentless extraction, believing implicitly that efficiency was directly proportional to suffering. The conflict was simple, elemental, and brutal, 50 lives against the absolute entrenched power of one man and the system that shielded him. The tension began not with shouting or resistance, but with the quiet, the sudden unnatural lack of energy among the 50. They moved slower in the fields, their hoes hitting the dirt with the sound of fatigue, not industry. They were spectral, bodies conserving every last calorie, their movements governed by the biological imperative to merely exist until the next sunset. Elias, a man whose skin was the color of deep, aged mahogany and whose spirit was tempered steel, was the focal point of this desperate stasis. He had been a blacksmith before his capture, his hands still bearing the memory of heat and precision. Now they trembled only slightly with weakness. He was a silent man, known for his observation, and in the hours after the first night of hunger, he began his reconnaissance. How does one access the tools of annihilation when those tools are guarded by armed men and separated by sheer, unforgiving distance? This was the first open loop that consumed Elias. The cannon battery was manned by 5 rotational guards, soldiers paid directly by Malaki, men whose loyalty was thick as the syrup they guarded. Yet Elias knew that Malaki, arrogant in his absolute dominion, had grown lax. He trusted the fortifications more than the vigilance of his men. The powder magazine, a subterranean vault built into the sand dune, was secured by a single heavy brass lock. The keys, Elias knew, rested not on the guard captain's belt, but on a hook near Malachi's bedside, a sign of the commander's need to control every vital element personally. The development of their grim plan started in the suffocating blackness of the cane stalks, far from the watchful eyes of the overseers, where the rustling wind mimicked whispers. Elias, flanked by 4 others, Jara, a woman who had lost 3 children to the fevers and held a bottomless reserve of cold vengeance, Samuel, a massive man whose quiet strength was legendary, Caleb, the youngest, whose desperation was the sharpest, and the old man, Abednego, whose memory of previous failed revolts offered chilling lessons in discretion, began to communicate not through spoken words, which carried too far in the night air, but through the language of touch and silence. They were 50, but only these 5 constituted the inner council, the engine of the decision. They established a grim pattern interrupt in their days, moments of shared, silent calculation during the brief midday rest, interrupted by the overseer's whip. The violence served only to sharpen their focus. Every stripe that tore skin was a further tally mark, a justification for the ultimate, unholy reversal they were plotting. Elias's biggest concern was the acquisition of the charges. The 12-pounders required specific powder bags and iron balls. Stealing those was impossible without triggering an alarm. However, he remembered that the recent defensive drill had left 3 heavy bags of powder and several ready-to-load balls stacked temporarily in a poorly secured shack near the armory entrance, intended for swift transfer to the magazine the following morning. Malachi's meticulousness was often undone by his own impatience. The physical toll of the starvation became a terrifying ally. The overseers stopped watching them as closely. They looked less like rebellious men and more like dying animals, too weak to pose a threat. The guards felt safe. This was the dark camouflage. Their bodies failing them was interpreted as compliance. The re-engagement hammered home the existential stakes. It wasn't about liberty yet. It was about survival. Elias watched Caleb, the young one whose face was now drawn and shadowed, try to sip dew from a broad leaf, his body shuddering with involuntary cramps. If they waited one more week, even if they won, they would be too weak to load the cannons, too weak to fight, too weak to run. The only path forward was immediate deadly commitment. They were already dead men walking. Their only hope lay in turning their own execution into their masters. The climax was precipitated not by a decision made in secret, but by a declaration made in public, cementing the necessity of violence. On the 5th day, Commander Malachi rode out to the field, flanked by 4 armed overseers and the captain of the guard, a hulking brute named Kretch. The 50 workers, standing motionless in the wilting sunlight, resembled scarecrows in threadbare cotton. Malachi stopped his stallion, the horse nervous and stomping, kicking up dirt that tasted like gold dust to the starving men. Malachi did not raise his voice. His tone was level, detached, the voice of a man explaining an unfortunate but necessary accounting measure. "I see the work has suffered," Malachi announced, his voice carrying clearly over the rustle of the cane. "I understand you are weak. That is acceptable. Weakness is easily managed. But let me be perfectly clear, field hands. The deficit in production has been quantified. The cost of your rations exceeds the value of your labor. Effective immediately and permanently, your group is designated as a low-priority investment." He paused, allowing the brutal meaning to sink in. Abednego inhaled sharply, a sound like dry leaves crumbling. "There will be no more rations for this 50, Malachi continued, his eyes scanning them with cold disdain. "You will subsist on what you manage to forage. If you survive, you work. If you die, the waste is minimal. Kretch," he addressed the captain, "if I see any of this lot attempting to raid the general stores, the consequence is not merely the whip, it is the tree and the rope. Understand this. The life has been taken from you by your own inefficiency. It is merely a matter of time now." He turned his horse, utterly dismissive, leaving them with the crushing weight of his final chilling assessment. He had officially signed their death warrants and walked away, confident that the logistics of starvation would handle the rest. Elias did not look at the commanders retreating back. He looked at Jara, whose face was a mask of distilled hatred. He looked at Samuel, whose massive hands had involuntarily clenched into fists capable of snapping bone. Malachi's declaration was the trigger. It closed the loop on hope. There was no negotiation, no eventual return to minimum sustenance. It was death. The only option left was to seize the means of their defense. That evening, as the moon was swallowed by cloud cover, providing a darkness deep enough to drown in, the 5 leaders moved. The conclusion was swift and silent. Elias had meticulously studied the rhythms of the plantation guards. He knew the quarter hour during the 4 a.m. shift change when Kretsch, the captain, stepped away for his private moments of liquor and repose. The decision had been made in the fields. They would attack the armory shack immediately, securing the powder and the iron balls. The second, more dangerous phase, stealing the key to the magazine from Malachi's bedside, would follow if the initial siege failed to yield enough ammunition. Elias, Samuel, and Jara moved like shadows toward the shack near the great battery. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and the metallic tang of fear. Every step was a promise, every rustle of dry grass a potential betrayal. They reached the flimsy wooden structure. It was locked with a simple iron latch, easily bypassed by the small tempered spike Elias had kept hidden in the sole of his boot for years. The latch clicked open with a sound like a pistol shot in the profound stillness. They slipped inside. The contents were exactly as Elias had predicted. 3 heavy linen sacks of gunpowder, pre-measured charges weighing 12 pounds each, meant for the cannons. And beside them, nested carefully in a wooden crate, the heavy, unforgiving iron balls. The weight of the powder bags felt like salvation, but also damnation. It was the moment of no return. They were no longer starving field hands. They were revolutionaries holding the tools of total war. They retreated back to the shadows, distributing the weight carefully among the waiting 50, each man and woman now carrying a portion of the charge, a piece of the decision to murder their master. Their faces, gaunt and drawn by starvation, were now lit by the cold, fierce light of absolute resolve. The next sound Fort Reliance would hear would be the deafening roar of those 12-pounders, aimed inland, not out to sea. Prepare now for the weight of the iron. Prepare for the silent, terrified ascent to the battery and the terrifying logistics of turning instruments of imperial defense into weapons of desperate, righteous retribution. The powder is secured. The balls are counted. The only remaining question is which of the 50 will fall and whether the first cannonball will strike the sleeping commander square in his monumental arrogance. The hunger was not merely a physical emptiness, it was a psychological entity, a cold, dry demon that had taken root in the soft tissues of their desperation. It hollowed the bone and sharpened the mind into a fine, brittle point of malice. 48 hours had passed since the decree, the sudden brutal severance of their already meager existence, and the world had begun to tilt. The field of Cain, usually seen as endless labor, now appeared as an insurmountable wall separating them from necessary oblivion. They moved with a skeletal economy of motion, the weight of their own exhaustion heavier than any burden the master's overseers could impose. It was in this profound state of depletion that the first dangerous whispers began to coalesce. Not in the usual hiding places of the slave quarters, but in the thick, suffocating darkness beneath the Old North granary. This cellar, long abandoned and frequently flooded, was chosen precisely because its stench, a potent cocktail of stale mildew, rat feces, and the sour scent of stagnant earth, was repugnant even to the lowest caste of supervisors. 50 souls, now reduced to the gaunt likeness of spectres, gathered there, their breathing shallow, rhythmic sounds swallowed by the heavy air. They leaned against the rough-hewn pilings, their bodies vibrating slightly with the chronic aching tremor that accompanies severe caloric deprivation. The discussion was not about flight. Flight was a childish dream, a temporary reprieve ending inevitably in the snap of hounds' jaws or the agonizing public display of a whipping post. Flight required energy, and energy was a luxury now violently revoked. Their focus had shifted, with the ruthless efficiency of pure starvation, toward permanence, toward the utter annihilation of the source of their suffering. It was Abel, a man whose hands had once shaped fine wood, but now only trembled, who first spoke the unthinkable, connecting the distant, gleaming threat of the master's artillery to their immediate visceral pain. The plantation, built during an earlier century of coastal anxiety, was less a farm and more a fortified estate, possessing a defensive arsenal wholly disproportionate to its peaceful agricultural function. High atop the southern ramparts, overlooking the rolling fields and, crucially, overlooking the master's main residence and adjacent barracks, sat 4 12-pound naval cannons. Iron behemoths, cold and silent, meant to repel phantom invaders from the sea, yet aimed perpetually in an unintentional posture of menace towards the very center of the estate. The realization struck them with the force of a revelation. The master had armed his own tomb. The terror of the plan was twofold. First, the physical impossibility. To manipulate those instruments of war required strength they no longer possessed. They were dealing with hundreds of pounds of cold, unforgiving metal. The carriages alone were immense, built for stability against the recoil of a massive charge. Second, the logistical suicide. The cannons were visible, exposed, and while rarely manned, the ordnance magazine, the repository of black powder, shot and wadding, was separated by a wide, open courtyard and guarded, if lazily, by 2 watchmen, whose vigilance was maintained only by cheap rum and the expectation of future violence. The conspiracy became a meticulous study in slow motion, a macabre choreography performed by starving men. Their days continued as a cruel imitation of labor. Their minds, however, were occupied entirely by trajectories, load weights, and the timing of the moon's cycle. The master, whose tyranny was sustained by habit and predictable terror, was oblivious to the shift in the psychological landscape. He mistook their gaunt lethargy for compliance, their slow movements for final defeat. He did not see the focused, crystalline intensity in their sunken eyes, the dangerous new metabolism fueled not by food, but by incandescent hatred. The first step was reconnaissance of the magazine. This fell to Moses, a field hand known for his profound silence and his unnerving ability to disappear into plain sight, a man whose presence was often ignored until the moment he was needed. Over the course of 3 consecutive nights, using the heavy cover of fog rolling up from the low coastal marsh, Moses mapped the rotation of the watchmen, chronicling the precise 15-minute window when both guards were routinely consumed by a drunken stupor near the south wall fire pit. The waiting was the most brutal element. Every ache of the stomach was a reminder of the penalty for failure. Some of the 50 began to hallucinate, their bodies feeding on stored muscle and bone. The visions turning the master's white manor house into a beacon of grotesque plenty, a structure built of loaves of bread and rivers of milk. This internal horror served only to solidify their murderous resolve. They were no longer seeking freedom. They were seeking final vengeance, a release so violent it would shatter the foundations of the slave system itself, ensuring that even if they died in the attempt, the sound of their parting would echo through history. The night selected for the operation was dense and moonless, the air heavy with the promise of rain. It was the deepest part of the night, what plantation owners ironically termed the slave sleep, the few short hours allotted for rest. 12 of the 50 were chosen for the magazine run, the strongest among the starved, a cruel designation, as strong now meant merely less immediately frail. They moved like shadows cut from the very fabric of the darkness. The approach to the powder magazine was fraught. The first obstacle, the guards. They were dispatched not with swift blades which risked immediate noise, but with the cold efficiency of field tools. Heavy, blunt instruments used for clearing stubborn roots. The silence of the act was crucial, sickeningly so. The sound was a dull, wet thud, followed by the soft collapse of heavy, liquor-soaked bodies. The 12 men did not look at each other, nor did they pause to register the horror of the required brutality. They were past the threshold of morality, driven by a survival instinct that demanded the ultimate sacrifice of conscience. The magazine itself was a low, squat stone structure, smelling powerfully of saltpeter and earth. Inside, the sheer quantity of power was intimidating. Small, tight barrels of the finest grade black powder, reserved not for hunting, but for war. They could not risk carrying the barrels. The sound of rolling wood on stone would carry across the silent compound. Instead, they used lengths of repurposed canvas and burlap sacks, carefully spooning the granular death into temporary carriers. The powder was dense, cool to the touch, and seemed to hum with silent energy. Each sack they filled represented not just a charge, but a life, a choice, an irreversible commitment to total war. The weight of the filled sacks, though relatively small compared to their usual burdens, felt monumental on their wasted frames. They had to navigate back through the open compound, past the silent, looming presence of the master's house, where a single, low light always burned in the study, a testament to his perpetual, nervous vigil. The next phase was the integration of the components. The 4 cannons were positioned hundreds of yards away on the stone ramparts. This was where the bulk of the 50 were deployed, working in rotating shifts under the constant, maddening threat of discovery. The process of shifting the cannons, of rotating their massive, spiked carriages from their intended coastal defense stance to face inland directly toward the manor, was agonizing. The iron wheels ground loudly on the stone platform, forcing them to pause every few feet, holding their collective breath, listening for the shouted alarm that never came. They used greased wooden wedges, leverage, and the terrible, focused strength born of famine. Muscle fibers tore, fingers were crushed against cold iron, but the work continued. Each cannon was given a name, not of a god or a hero, but a name representing a shared, profound loss. The Whisper, for the secrets they kept. Hunger's Justice, the rations reckoning, and the largest, aimed squarely at the master's bedroom window, was simply dubbed 48, commemorating the hours of unbearable starvation that had catalyzed this insanity. The preparation had to be invisible. The powder and shot, heavy lead balls the size of large oranges, were meticulously hidden beneath loose flagstones on the rampart floor, covered with dust and debris to look undisturbed. The master, Jarrett, was a man of perverse ritual. He enjoyed walking the ramparts at sunrise, surveying his domain, his own twisted sense of security linked to the sight of his silent, shining ordnance. It was during one of these terrifying inspections that the plan nearly collapsed entirely. Jarrett, his face perpetually flushed and blotchy from rich living and anxiety, approached Hunger's Justice. He paused, tapping the smooth iron barrel with the carved end of his cane. He was seeking reassurance, a visible sign that his investments in defense were sound. One of the men assigned to that cannon, a slender young man named Silas, had forgotten to properly align the massive linstock hook, the small bracket used to hold the match for firing. It was slightly askew. Jarrett's eyes, magnified by his growing paranoia, caught the anomaly. He stopped, his tapping cane ceased, and the silence that descended was thick enough to choke on. The master, without looking at Silas, casually asked, his voice low and dangerous, "Silas, does that hook sit true?" Silas, barely able to stand from weakness, knew that the slightest hesitation would trigger the explosion of Jarrat's rage and the subsequent discovery of their entire plot. His mind, honed by terror, provided the only possible answer. "No, sir," Silas replied, his voice a dry croak, instantly dropping to his knees. "I noticed it this morning. The night cold must have shrunk the wood carriage just a hair, shifting the metal. Let me through it now, sir. Don't want no corrosion getting in the gap." It was a brilliant lie, a combination of servile fear and technical understanding that appealed to Jarrat's obsession with preservation and order. Jarrat watched, impassive, as Silas, with trembling hands, used a small rock to tap the heavy iron hook back into alignment, a performance of meticulous subservience. Jarrat merely grunted, satisfied by the display of maintenance, and moved on, unaware that the hands fixing his cannon were the same hands preparing to load the lethal shot that would tear his body apart. The moment passed, but it served as a brutal pattern interrupt, forcing the conspirators to review their entire methodology. They realized they could not rely on stealth alone. They had to anticipate the master's movements, to use his arrogance as their camouflage. The conspiracy was now irrevocably locked into place. They had the powder, the shot, and the heavy artillery was aimed. They were no longer merely 50 starving slaves. They were a collective, internal siege force, armed with the master's own thunder, waiting for the signal. The question was no longer if they would fire, but when, and what final, terrible necessity would finally trigger the blast. They had crossed the line from survival to total annihilation, and there was no turning back to the fields, only forward into the blinding muzzle flash of their desperate, murderous freedom. The heavy iron mouth of 48 loomed over the manor, a silent, terrible judge. The 50 watched the manor, their shadows long and thin in the growing daylight, knowing that the smallest tremor, the slightest sound of discovery, would force them to move the timeline forward. They were now perched on the apex of their revolt. The weight of the powder and the metallic chill of the cannon barrels, the only substantial things left in their hollow world. The darkness was receding, and with the light came the full, terrifying realization of what they were about to unleash upon the sleeping tyrant who had mistaken hunger for docility. The stage was set, the powder dry, and the master, now sensing only minor disturbances in the general, terrified obedience, was unknowingly sleeping through the final rehearsal for his execution. The great question hung in the humid air. Would they wait for the perfect moment, or would the master's paranoia force their hand prematurely, turning their desperate rebellion into a bloody, glorious suicide? The wind died entirely just before midnight, leaving the sprawling acreage of the plantation trapped beneath a suffocating blanket of silence, thick and absorbent like newly fallen snow. This stillness, however, was not peaceful. It was the taut, dangerous vacuum that precedes a catastrophic collapse, the moment before a breath is taken that will irrevocably alter the course of history. 50 hearts hammered a desperate, irregular rhythm against 50 sets of ribs, a quiet drumming that somehow seemed louder than the chirp of the cicadas or the distant baying of the hounds secured in their kennels. Obasi, his face smeared with axle grease and fear, knelt beside the massive iron-muzzled weapon, its dark surface slick with dew, aimed with painstaking, terrifying precision at the glowing, brightly lit upper windows of the manor house, 300 yards away. This was the final gamble, the desperate throw of the dice by men already condemned to perpetual penury and early graves. The loss of the rations had not just been a cruelty, it was a death sentence delivered with casual malice, starvation being the slowest and most agonizing method of disposal. Now these men, driven by the primal, screaming necessity of survival, were no longer slaves. They were engineers of their own violent liberation. The cannon, a relic meant perhaps to fend off coastal marauders or instill fear in the local populace, was now their hammer of justice. Its very existence had been a symbol of the master's absolute, unassailable power. Now it was the vehicle for his annihilation. The target was impossible to miss, The dining room, where Master Bartholomew was currently entertaining a small contingent of creditors and associates, celebrating perhaps the efficient cruelty of his latest financial strategy, starving his own labor force to cut costs. The light pouring from those high windows seemed almost arrogant in its glow, a beacon of privilege and ignorance against the deep, brooding darkness of the night. Obasi felt the cold, gritty sensation of the slow match in his hand, a thin, smouldering fuse of hemp and saltpeter. It felt less like a tool of war and more like a stolen key to a rusted, bloody lock. The tension was a physical entity, pressing down on the group huddled around the heavy carriage of the cannon. They had labored for hours to maneuver it, to procure and secure the sparse, aging powder cache, and to ram home the improvised shot. A chaotic, deadly mixture of scrap metal, hardened clay, and anything sharp they could find in the estate's decrepit forge. But the greatest conflict was internal, the unbearable weight of the action. They knew, intimately, the immediate and unforgiving response the first thunderous boom would provoke. The moment that cannon fired, the world would simplify into two categories, hunter and prey, and the odds remained staggeringly against the latter. There were still open loops twisting in the minds of the 49 men waiting behind Obasi. Had they measured the elevation correctly? Had the powder been corrupted by the damp air? Most terrifyingly, had the stable guards, notorious for their late-night rounds, been alerted by their faint necessary movements? The slightest error, a puff of smoke prematurely seen, a loose stone dislodged, would mean not only the failure of the attack, but a horrific retribution that would make Bartholomew's previous cruelties seem like child's play. The moment stretched, thin and agonizing. Obasi raised his hand, signaling the men to ready themselves to pull back into the dense line of cedars bordering the field the second the weapon discharged. He could smell the sulphurous tang of the slow match and the metallic scent of fear emanating from his own pores. He lowered his arm. Then a sound, sharp and unexpected, a distant drunken laugh echoing from the manor, followed by the faint tinkle of crystal glasses. A pattern interrupt, shattering the meditative focus of their terror. That laugh, hollow, superior, dripping with contempt, galvanized the group more than any battle cry. It was the sound of the world they were fighting to burn down. Obasi plunged the glowing tip of the slow match into the vent, a hiss, then a crackle. The wick spat sparks, brief, intense bursts of light that danced wildly in the immediate darkness before disappearing into the powder trail. For a terrifying, eternal fraction of a second, nothing happened. Doubt, cold and paralyzing, stabbed through Obasi. Had the powder failed? Had they truly doomed themselves for a puff of smoke? Then came the roar. It was not merely loud, it was tectonic. A massive, concussive wave of sound and pressure slammed into the surrounding landscape, shaking the damp earth beneath their bare feet. The old cannon, unused for years, protested the sudden violence with a screech of rusted iron before vomiting fire and smoke into the night. The flash was blinding, momentary sunshine against the pitch black, revealing the frozen faces of the men, illuminated in ghastly relief. The recoil was violent, shuddering the carriage back several feet, necessitating immediate bracing from the men assigned to secure it. The sound of the impact that followed was different, a sickening, heavy thud followed instantly by the explosive shattering of glass and the brittle splintering of ancient hardwood. The round had hit. It had struck the lower corner of the dining room bay window, missing the center mass of the house by a devastatingly close margin. A cacophony of shrieks and confused shouts erupted from the house. They saw figures scrambling away from the now gaping hole, silhouetted against the roaring orange glow that instantly began to bloom inside the structure. But the hit was only partial. It was a wound, but not the mortal blow they required. "Reload!" Obasi roared, his voice hoarse, fighting the ringing in his ears. The men moved with brutal, practiced speed. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burnt sulfur and smoke, billowing out and shrouding them partially from the line of sight of the manor. This was the true terror, the re-engagement with the violence. They had succeeded only in provoking the beast. The alarm bells were ringing now, shrill and desperate, piercing the smoke-filled night. The guards, suddenly roused from their complacency, were emerging from the stables and the surrounding slave quarters where they usually congregated, torches flaring erratically. They were disoriented, but rapidly organizing. The sound of running feet and rough shouts cut through the ringing in the air, confirming their worst fears. The clock was ticking down to 0. They rammed the second, hastily prepared projectile into the barrel, this one even more densely packed with nails and shards of broken ceramic. The cannon was still hot, dangerously so, and the process was clumsy, fueled by adrenaline and a primal fear of capture. The muzzle was swung slightly, adjusting the elevation, aiming higher this time for the master bedroom suite right above the dining hall, where Bartholomew's private study, filled with irreplaceable ledgers and documents of ownership, was located. The destruction needed to be symbolic, absolute and undeniably final. A burst of musket fire spat light from the nearest outbuilding. The slugs whistled past the cannon, tearing through the leaves of the cedars where the rest of the group was hidden. A man, Silas, standing too close to the firing line, let out a wet, gurgling cry and collapsed, his blood darkening the damp earth near the cannon wheel. The cost of liberation had already been paid, and they had barely begun. Obasi ignored the terrifying intimacy of Silas's death. He seized the match, now shortened and burning furiously, and plunged it into the vent once more. This time, the weapon fired instantly, almost anticipating the contact. The second blast was even more violent, fueled by the residual heat in the barrel. It was a sound that annihilated silence, a pure expression of vengeful fury. The projectile screamed through the night air, visible for a microsecond as a streak of darkness against the chaotic fires now consuming the lower floor. This time, the shot found its mark with horrifying precision. The trajectory was perfect. It struck the central column supporting the master's study, where Bartholomew was likely rushing to secure his most valuable assets, or perhaps simply frozen in terrified disbelief. The impact was not a mere shattering, it was the total structural disintegration of that portion of the house. The entire section of the manor's second floor seemed to sigh, buckle, and then collapse inward upon itself, dragging down timbers, stone, and the shrieking figures within. A vast, terrifying mushroom cloud of dust, smoke, and fine plaster rose over the scene. The immediate, definitive sound was the agonizing, crunching weight of the roof structure falling, followed by a deeper, sustained roar as the fire, finally fed by the dry internal structure, took hold with ravenous intensity. The manor house, the imposing fortress of their suffering, was screaming its death throes. This was the climax. It was the great revelation that power, no matter how entrenched, could be reversed by desperate hands and stolen instruments. The open loop of Bartholomew's survival slammed shut with the falling debris. The chaos that followed was total. The remaining guards, seeing the impossible happen, their master's house crumbling before their eyes, were thrown into a state of stunned panic. Their authority, built solely on the foundation of the master's presence and wealth, evaporated instantly. Some turned to flee, others fired wildly and aimlessly into the darkness. Obasi, drenched in sweat and the phantom warmth of the cannon's heat, turned to the 48 surviving men. His voice, though still raw, carried the terrible authority of the newly empowered. "We run, now not back to the quarters, to the swamp. Take Silas, take nothing else." They melted back into the shadows of the cedar line, leaving the burning, smoking ruin of the estate behind them. They left the cannon where it lay, hot and smoking, a solitary, undeniable monument to the violence of their release. The journey into the dense cypress swamps and humid darkness beyond the plantation boundaries was not a celebration. It was a desperate, immediate test of survival. The air that rushed into their lungs was the first air of true freedom they had ever tasted, but it was poisoned with the metallic tang of blood, the deep, pervasive smell of gunpowder, and the bitter smoke trailing behind them. The terror had not ended, it had merely shifted locale. The master was definitively dead, buried beneath the burning ruins of his own architectural arrogance. The men who had suffered his tyranny had transformed through a single violent act, from property into insurgents, from chattel into fugitives carrying the full weight of murder on their backs. They moved like ghosts through the palmetto thickets, the only light coming from the immense orange glow of the burning manor miles behind them, a terrible guiding star marking the end of one life and the beginning of 50 uncertain others. Every snap of a twig, every splash in the brackish water was the sound of the hounds already being released, the sound of the manhunt that would define the rest of their days. But as they pushed deeper into the suffocating humidity of the swamps, away from the smell of burning wood and closer to the smell of stagnant water and earth, a profound truth settled over them. They were alive. They had killed the thing that sought to kill them. They had turned the symbols of their oppression into the instruments of their liberation. The cost was high, measured in the life of Silas and the eternal anxiety of the fugitive life, but the payoff was immeasurable. The plantation was silenced, its arrogant voice extinguished. All that remained was the distant flickering light of a raging inferno and the silence of the swamp absorbing the sound of 50 ragged breaths of men who had proven that the human spirit, starved and abused, possesses a terrible explosive strength when pushed past the point of no return. The horror had concluded its first act. The tyrant was felled. Now the second, longer act of true survival outside the chains of the system, was beginning. A cold, challenging terror that promised no end but the grave, yet carried the sweet, terrifying possibility of being a free grave. Consider the aftermath. The lingering shadow of that smoke, the ash falling miles away like bitter snow, settling on fields that would no longer be worked for a master who had ceased to exist. Listen to the silence where the screams of the manor used to be. Understand the profound, brutal transaction that took place that night, the exchange of a lifetime of servitude for a single defining moment of monstrous necessity. Think of the fire, consuming the history of their bondage, and ask yourself, what is the true price of such a freedom, purchased with powder and blood?